It's just past 10 GMT and we start in Kyiv, where Ukrainian officials say 4 people have been killed in Russian drone strikes on the region. Military sources say a civilian object was damaged in the attack and rescue workers are still on the scene. Well, for more on this, let's bring in our correspondent Stephanie Decker. She's live for us in Kyiv. It's the first attack on a residential building in the Kyiv region in months. Stephanie, what more do we know about it?
Yes, the first since December. Actually, videos just emerged at night, which shows you can hear the sound of a drone just before you see the explosion light up the night sky. The 4th and 5th stories of 2 residential buildings are being described as dormitories by the head of the regional police there. 4 killed, as you mentioned, 2 were injured, and from what we understand, a rescue operation goes on. 16 drones were shot out of the sky, intercepted by Ukrainian air defenses overnight, out of 21, we understand. The Ukrainian president also addressed the incident, calling them murderous drones and saying, as they refer to peace in Moscow, orders are given to launch these kinds of drones, of course, referring there to China's peace plan that was at some point discussed on the table between those 2 leaders. Again, you know, Kyiv is, of course, the capital. It does still see attacks, much more sporadic, of course, long-range missiles, particularly targeting its civilian infrastructure like power plants, electricity plants. And then you still have these kinds of incidents, which is a reminder that it does remain an active war zone. The air sirens do go off pretty much on a daily basis. People have long ignored those air sirens, and the Kyiv local police, who was quoted as part of this operation of rescue, said that the 4th person killed was a 40-year-old driver that they removed from the building, saying he did not listen to the air raid sirens. But, you know, the reality is that a year onto this war, when you have those sirens going on a daily basis, people simply have to go on with their daily lives.
Stephanie, thank you very much for that. That is Stephanie Decker with the latest live in Kyiv. And in Crimea, Russian officials say the Navy has repelled a drone attack on the Sevastopol port. This comes 2 days after an explosion on the peninsula destroyed Russian missiles. That's according to Ukraine's defense ministry. They were intended for use by Moscow's Black Sea Fleet. The Russian administrator of Zankoy has said the city had come under attack from drones. Let's bring in journalist Yulia Shapovalova now from Moscow. And the Kremlin-backed mayor of Sevastopol, is saying that the Russian Navy repelled this drone attack on the port in Russian-annexed Crimea, the port of Sevastopol, that is. What are you hearing about this in Moscow, Yulia?
That's correct. Here in Moscow, we are receiving reports that the Black Sea Fleet repelled the attack by Ukrainian drones, which destroyed 3 objects. According to the governor of Sevastopol, Mikhail Razvazhayev, he published the information in his Telegram channel. He said that the drones tried to get to the bay, into the bay. The Russian sailors fired small arms at them, and there were no casualties. Some windows into buildings, residential buildings, were blown out due to explosions caused by destroyed drones. So the attack happened at around 8 in the morning local time. So basically the all-out war is expanding, and as you said not so long ago, a massive strike by several Ukrainian UAVs was carried out in Jankoy on the Crimean Peninsula. Late Monday evening on March the 20th, at least 6 UAVs of the Chinese Mugin 5 type equipped with explosives were used in the attack, and local authorities reported that 2 civilian objects were damaged. 1 person was hurt. The Russian side said most of the drones were intercepted. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine announced the destruction of Russian caliber cruise missiles there, which were transported by rail. So basically, Jankoy is a huge rail hub, and according to Ukraine, they just wanted probably to destroy some logistics, and it could have caused some problems for the Russian army. But basically, according to the Russian side, all the railroads work regularly, and none of that infrastructure actually was affected by that attack.
All right, Yulia, thank you for that. That is Yulia Shapovalova live in Moscow. Thank you. After more than a year of war, here's where things stand on the ground. Russia controls much of the territory east of the Dnipro River. A Ukrainian counter-offensive in the autumn reclaimed swathes of land in the north and south, including the city of Kherson. Now the fighting is concentrated on the city of Bakhmut, where the two sides have been locked in an extended stalemate. We're going to bring in Achille Despres. He's the Ukraine spokesperson for the International Committee of the Red Cross, and he's joining us live from Kyiv. Thank you very much for your time on Al Jazeera. If we look at the fighting that's been taking place around the city of Bakhmut, what is the situation for people remaining in and around Bakhmut now?
Look, I was myself in localities around Bakhmut on Friday, and our teams went there again on Saturday in the areas very close to the city and in other areas near the front line. The scale of destruction is shocking. Very few buildings haven't been destroyed or damaged. We are seeing, when we are driving there with our convoys of humanitarian aid, we are seeing schools, homes, hospitals that have been destroyed. And it's incredible to imagine that civilians are still living in these areas, but they are. That's why it's so important that we are bringing them humanitarian aid, because people living in these areas are lacking the essentials. They're lacking water, they're lacking food, they're lacking hygiene items, they're lacking repair material to repair broken windows or broken doors. So they're living in very, very dire conditions. And that's what we at the International Committee of the Red Cross are trying to help them with in these very difficult circumstances.
And what about evacuating people from Bakhmut? I know that most of the population of Bakhmut has actually left. Are you able to get everyone out? Is everyone living in Bakhmut willing to leave, especially given that many of the people who are there have been displaced so many times already?
As you said, most civilians living in the city of Bakhmut have already evacuated. However, they have sometimes evacuated to cities that are very close to Bakhmut or very close to the active front line. I spoke myself to a member of the city council of Bakhmut, and she told me that in the city of Konstantinivka, which is right after Bakhmut, more than 200 families from Bakhmut are living. And basically when they left, because the hostilities were just too intense or because the front line was coming too close to them, they had nothing with them but what they could carry. So they need really everything, from clothes to blankets to hygiene items. So even people who have already evacuated from the most active areas of fighting, they still remain very close to the front line, and they still have really basic humanitarian needs. And we should also not forget that in areas close to the front lines and in the cities close to Bakhmut, there are also some people who simply cannot evacuate because they're elderly, because they're low mobility, or also people who simply refuse to leave their homes. So that's why it's incredibly important that humanitarian actors such as the International Committee of the Red Cross are able to bring in this assistance into these very dangerous areas that sadly civilians are still living in.
And as you mentioned, there are so many elderly, there are people with mobility issues, but for those who can leave but choose not to, I mean, they're not going to be convinced by the fact that they can't actually go very far. They're just going to be around Bakhmut, and they are still going to be dependent on this humanitarian assistance. So is there anything that you can actually do to convince the people who can leave to leave?
Look, for us, our objective is not necessarily to convince people to leave, but it's also to serve the needs of the people wherever they are. We know that civilians remain next to the front line in these areas that are very dangerous. And when I spoke to people there, I spoke to a young man, a 19-year-old man named Daniel, who was telling me that he could leave, but he just doesn't want to because he has his grandfather in the area. He has lots of elderly people in this village that he is living in, and he just doesn't want to leave them. And this is a situation that we can all understand as a very difficult situation. Nevertheless, we need to help these people where they are, and we need to provide them with basic things. Just late last week, I was on a convoy that managed to bring 17 tons of food to areas near the front line and 6,000 liters of drinking water to these communities. So that's what they need to simply survive. As one resident of these cities, a man named Nikolai, told me very bluntly, people here are not really living, they're merely surviving. And that's what we have to help them do in these very difficult conditions.
Mr. Despres, we thank you very much for bringing us the picture from Bakhmut, the humanitarian situation after months of fighting around it. That is Kyiv Despres of the International Committee of the Red Cross joining us live from Kyiv. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
And Chinese President Xi Jinping